The car rolled into Sarah's driveway, the faint hum of the engine breaking the silence of the suburban street. She sat still for a moment, her hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. On the passenger seat, the doll sat upright, its vacant glass eyes reflecting the dim glow of the porch light. Sarah glanced at the rearview mirror once more. The shadow she thought she'd seen earlier, small, still, watching, was no longer there. She shook her head, trying to push away the creeping unease that had followed her all the way from the creek. "Get a grip, Sarah," she muttered to herself, reaching for the doll. Its porcelain face was cool to the touch, almost too cool, and for a fleeting second, she thought she felt it pulse under her fingers. She yanked her hand back instinctively, but then forced herself to laugh. "It's just a doll," she said out loud, as if speaking the words would make them true. Inside the house, Lucas was already asleep, his small frame curled under a dinosaur print blanket. Sarah tucked the doll onto a shelf in the living room, nestled between a row of books she hadn't touched in years. It looked harmless there, just another forgotten trinket in a house full of them. But as Sarah climbed into bed that night, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had brought something, or someone, home with her. The clock on Sarah's nightstand glowed faintly in the dark, 3:12 a.m. She woke suddenly, her heart pounding in her chest. At first, she didn't know why. The house was quiet, the kind of stillness that felt too perfect, too forced. And then she heard it, a soft creak, like the sound of a small footstep on the hardwood floor. It came from the hallway outside her bedroom. "Lucas," she called out, her voice trembling slightly. No answer. She grabbed her phone from the nightstand, using the screen's dim light to guide her as she tiptoed toward the door. The hallway was empty, but something felt off. The air was heavier, colder. She could see her breath misting faintly in front of her. As she turned to check Lucas's room, her eyes caught something unusual. The doll. It was sitting on the floor at the end of the hallway, its head tilted slightly to one side. Her breath hitched. She distinctly remembered putting the doll on the shelf in the living room. It was impossible for it to be here. Forcing herself to move, Sarah walked over and picked it up. The porcelain felt colder than before, almost icy, and she swore she felt a faint vibration, like a heartbeat. She clutched it tightly, convincing herself she must have simply forgotten where she'd left it. But as she turned back toward her room, she thought she heard it, a soft giggle, distant but unmistakable. The next morning, Lucas was sitting at the breakfast table, his cereal untouched. Sarah noticed his eyes darting toward the doll, which she had placed back on the shelf in the living room. "Mom, who's the girl in the house?" he asked suddenly, his voice quiet but steady. Sarah froze, the coffee cup halfway to her lips. "What girl, Lucas?" "The one with the doll," he said, pointing toward the living room. "She was standing by my bed last night. She said the doll is hers." Sarah's grip tightened on the cup. "You probably just had a bad dream, sweetheart. There's no girl here." Lucas shook his head. "She said her name is Lily. She wants her doll back." Sarah felt a cold chill run down her spine. The name echoed in her head, dredging up the image of the small memorial by the creek, the faded photograph of a little girl with a shy smile. As the day went on, Sarah couldn't shake the conversation with Lucas. She tried to keep busy, but every time she walked past the living room, she found her eyes drawn to the doll. It seemed to be watching her, its glassy eyes following her every move. By evening, the tension was unbearable. She decided to put the doll away, out of sight. Opening the storage closet in the hallway, she shoved it onto a high shelf, out of reach. She slammed the door shut and leaned against it, exhaling deeply. That night, as she was putting Lucas to bed, he asked her a question that made her blood run cold. "Mom, why did you put the doll in my room?" "What are you talking about, Lucas? It's not in your room." Lucas pointed to the corner, his face pale. Sarah turned slowly, her heart pounding. There, sitting neatly on the small chair by the window, was the doll. Its head was tilted, its expression eerily serene. Sarah grabbed it without hesitation and stormed out of the room, her mind racing. She didn't know how it had gotten there, but she knew one thing: something wasn't right. The next few nights were a blur of whispers, creaks, and shadows. Sarah started hearing things, soft footsteps pacing the hallway, faint laughter that seemed to come from nowhere. One night, she woke to find her bedroom door wide open, even though she was sure she had locked it. The doll was sitting in the doorway, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. She started sleeping with the lights on, but even that didn't help. Every time she closed her eyes, she felt like she was being watched. Lucas, too, was changing. He became quieter, more withdrawn. He spent hours drawing, filling pages with strange, unsettling images. A little girl with dark eyes, a doll with an eerie grin. "Lucas, why are you drawing these things?" Sarah asked one day, her voice trembling. Lucas looked up at her, his eyes wide. "She told me to." "Who told you?" "Lily," he whispered. "She says she wants to play." By the end of the week, Sarah knew she couldn't ignore it anymore. She needed answers. She needed to know who Lily was and why her presence was haunting their lives. She decided to go back to the antique store, hoping the owner could shed some light on the doll's history. But as she drove through the small town, an uneasy feeling settled over her. When she arrived, the shop looked different, darker, older. The windows were dusty, and the once vibrant, open sign hung crookedly. Pushing the door open, she was greeted by a hollow silence. "Hello," she called out, her voice echoing in the empty space. The old man from before appeared from the shadows, his face pale and drawn. "You shouldn't have taken it," he said, his voice trembling. "That doll, it's not just a toy. It's a tether." "A tether to what?" Sarah demanded, her frustration bubbling over. "To her," the man said simply. "To Lily." Sarah's stomach churned as the man began to tell her the story. A story of tragedy, anger, and a spirit that refused to move on. And as she listened, she realized that bringing the doll into her home was more than a mistake. It was an invitation. The antique shop's dim lighting and the musty smell of old wood and aged leather seemed to close in on Sarah as the old man began his story. His voice was low, measured, as if each word carried a weight he wasn't sure she was ready to bear. "She was just a child," he began, his eyes fixed on the counter as if unable to meet Sarah's gaze. "Lily grew up not far from here. Her family lived on the outskirts of town, near that creek where you found the doll. It was a quiet life, but not a happy one." Sarah felt a knot tighten in her stomach. "What happened to her?" she asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to hear the answer. The man sighed, rubbing a hand over his wrinkled face. "Her parents, well, let's just say they weren't the kindest people. Her father was a mean drunk, and her mother turned a blind eye to most of it. Lily found solace in her doll. It was the only thing she had that felt truly hers. She called it Ellie, and she carried it everywhere." Sarah glanced down at the doll in her hands. The name Ellie felt strangely familiar, as if the doll itself carried the weight of the name, whispering it through its cold, porcelain features. "One winter," the man continued, "her father came home in one of his rages. Lily tried to hide, but he found her. He blamed her for something, who knows what, and in his fury, he threw her doll into the creek. Lily ran after it, screaming, desperate to save it. But he trailed off, his expression darkening. Sarah's breath hitched. "But what?" "She slipped," he said simply. "The ice on the creek was thin that year. She fell through and she never came back up." The weight of his words settled heavily in the room. Sarah felt her chest tighten, a wave of sorrow and anger washing over her. "And the parents? What happened to them?" "They moved away not long after," the man said. "Some say they couldn't live with the guilt. Others say it was something else. They claimed the house was haunted, that they could hear her crying at night, begging for Ellie." Sarah shivered, the air in the shop feeling colder than before. "And the doll? How did it end up here?" The man hesitated. "It's been passed around for years. People find it by the creek, or it shows up in old houses. It always seems to find its way back here eventually. Some say it's cursed. Others think it's Lily herself, still searching for peace." "Why didn't you tell me all this when I first bought it?" Sarah demanded, her voice trembling with anger and fear. "I tried to warn you," the man said quietly, "but most people don't listen. They think it's just a story, just a doll, until it's too late." Sarah clenched her fists. I need to fix this. Lily, she's in my house. She's been watching my son. The old man's expression hardened. You need to get rid of it. How? Sarah asked, her voice rising in desperation. Do I take it back to the creek? Burn it? What do I do? The man shook his head. It's not that simple. Lily doesn't want to be let go. She wants to be remembered. She wants justice for what happened to her. Sarah's mind raced. Justice? What could she possibly do to give a ghost justice? And what would happen if she couldn't? The old man reached under the counter and pulled out a small, worn notebook. There's a ritual, he said, flipping through the pages. Something that might help, but it's dangerous. Sarah leaned closer, her pulse quickening. What kind of ritual? It's a way to sever the connection between Lily and the doll, he explained. But it requires confronting her, facing her anger head-on. If you're not strong enough? His voice trailed off, and Sarah felt a cold dread settle over her. What happens if I'm not strong enough? The man met her eyes for the first time, his gaze heavy with warning. Then she'll take you instead. Driving home, Sarah's hands trembled on the steering wheel. The doll sat in the passenger seat once again, its vacant eyes staring straight ahead. The old man's words echoed in her mind. She doesn't want to be let go. She wants to be remembered. Back at the house, Lucas was sitting on the living room floor, drawing quietly. His eyes lit up when he saw Sarah, but his smile faded as his gaze shifted to the doll. Mom, he said cautiously, she doesn't like you talking about her. Sarah's blood ran cold. What do you mean, Lucas? She says you're trying to get rid of her, Lucas said, his voice barely above a whisper. But she's not ready to leave. Sarah knelt down in front of him, placing her hands on his shoulders. Lucas, listen to me. I'm going to fix this, okay? I'm going to make everything better. Lucas looked at her with wide, fearful eyes. But what if she gets mad? Sarah didn't have an answer for that. She didn't want to think about what Lily might do if her anger was unleashed. That night, the house felt heavier than ever. Shadows seemed to move on their own, stretching and twisting across the walls. Every creak of the floorboards, every faint rustle of the curtains, felt charged with a sinister energy. Sarah kept the doll in her room, unwilling to leave it unattended. She sat on the edge of her bed, staring at it, trying to summon the courage to face what lay ahead. Lily, she whispered, her voice trembling. If you're here, please, show me what you want. The room fell silent, the air growing colder. And then, faintly, she heard it, a soft giggle, followed by the sound of tiny footsteps. Sarah turned her head slowly, her heart pounding. In the corner of the room, the shadows seemed to coalesce, forming the faint outline of a small figure. The air grew heavier, pressing down on her chest. Why did you leave me? A voice whispered, high and childlike, but tinged with an edge of anger. Sarah's breath hitched. Lily, is that you? The figure didn't answer, but the shadows seemed to pulse, inching closer. The doll on the bed began to vibrate, its glass eyes glinting in the dim light. I didn't mean to take you, Sarah said, her voice breaking. I just want to help you. The shadows stopped moving, and for a moment, the room was deathly silent. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the presence was gone. The doll lay still, its porcelain face blank and unyielding. But Sarah knew this was only the beginning. Lily wasn't going to let go that easily. The next morning, Sarah sat at the kitchen table with the old man's notebook laid out in front of her. The worn pages were filled with cryptic instructions, faded diagrams, and ominous warnings written in shaky handwriting. Each line seemed to drip with foreboding, as though the writer had been afraid of their own words. Lucas was at school, and for the first time in days, Sarah was alone in the house. The absence of his cheerful presence only amplified the silence, making the house feel like it was holding its breath. She traced her finger down the instructions, her eyes scanning the lines over and over to make sure she understood. Begin where it all ended. Speak her name, but tread carefully. Her anger runs deep. The doll must be returned to the place it was lost. Only there will she listen. The creek. That's where it had to happen. Sarah's stomach churned at the thought of returning to that place, but she knew there was no other option. Whatever Lily wanted, she wouldn't find peace until Sarah confronted her directly. Sarah spent the rest of the day gathering the items listed in the notebook. A white candle, a silver coin, a handful of river stones, and a mirror. All seemingly random objects that somehow held the key to ending this nightmare. She also packed a small bag with essentials, a flashlight, matches, and her phone, though she wasn't sure it would do her much good. There was no cell service near the creek, and she doubted the kind of danger she was facing could be solved with a 911 call. The doll sat on the kitchen counter, its empty eyes following her as she moved around the room. Every time she glanced at it, she felt a shiver run down her spine. It was just a doll, she told herself, but deep down, she knew that wasn't true. As the sun began to set, Sarah stood in the doorway, staring out at the quiet street. She had no idea what would happen once she got to the creek, but there was no turning back now. The drive felt longer this time, as if the road itself was reluctant to lead her back to the place where Lily's life had ended. The sky turned a deep orange as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the landscape. By the time Sarah reached the parking area near the trailhead, it was nearly dark. She stepped out of the car, the crunch of gravel under her boots the only sound in the still evening air. The doll was cradled in her arms, its weight feeling heavier than it should. The trail to the creek was just as she remembered it, narrow, winding, and lined with trees that seemed to close in around her. The air was colder here, sharper, and each step felt like it carried her deeper into a place she wasn't supposed to be. Halfway down the trail, Sarah stopped. She could hear it again, the faint giggle that had haunted her in the house. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, echoing through the trees like a disembodied whisper. "Lily," she called out, her voice trembling. The giggle stopped abruptly, replaced by a chilling silence. Sarah's grip on the doll tightened as she forced herself to keep moving. When she reached the creek, the sight of the water sent a shiver through her. The current was gentle, barely a trickle compared to the rushing waters she had imagined. It looked harmless, but Sarah knew better. She set the doll down on a flat rock near the edge of the water and began arranging the items she had brought. The candle was placed in front of the doll, the silver coin beside it, and the river stones in a small circle around them. The mirror was the final piece, propped up so that it reflected the doll's face. Taking a deep breath, Sarah lit the candle. The flame flickered weakly in the cold air, casting eerie shadows that danced across the surface of the creek. "Lily," she began, her voice steady despite the fear twisting in her chest. "I'm here to listen, to understand. Please, show me what you want." For a moment, nothing happened. The air was still, the only sound the soft babble of the creek. Then, the temperature dropped sharply, and the flame of the candle flickered violently before going out. Sarah's breath fogged in the freezing air as she felt a presence behind her. Slowly, she turned around. There she was. Lily stood at the edge of the trees, her small figure barely visible in the fading light. Her hair was wet and tangled, her dress clinging to her thin frame. But it was her eyes that held Sarah's attention, dark, hollow, and filled with something that looked like both sorrow and rage. "You took her from me," Lily said, her voice small but sharp, cutting through the air like a blade. "I didn't mean to," Sarah said, her voice shaking. "I didn't know." Lily tilted her head, studying Sarah with an intensity that made her stomach churn. "You brought her back," the child said, gesturing to the doll. "Yes," Sarah said quickly. "I brought her back. She's yours." Lily stepped closer, her bare feet making no sound on the forest floor. "But you still don't understand," she whispered. "Then help me," Sarah said, desperation creeping into her voice. "Tell me what you want, and I'll do it. I'll fix this." For a moment, Lily said nothing. Then, she raised a hand and pointed to the creek. "It's not just me," she said softly. "There are others." Sarah's heart stopped. "Others?" "They're waiting," Lily said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "And they're not as kind as I am." Before Sarah could respond, the mirror beside the doll shattered with a deafening crack, the shards scattering across the rocks. The air around her seemed to pulse, and the faint giggle that had haunted her before now grew louder, overlapping into a cacophony of voices. The creek seemed to darken, the water turning black as shadows began to rise from its surface. Shapes took form in the darkness, small, childlike figures with hollow eyes and twisted limbs. Sarah stumbled back, her heart racing. "Lily, what is this?" she cried. "They're the ones who never made it home," Lily said, her voice eerily calm. "Just like me." The figures moved closer, their hollow eyes fixed on Sarah. She felt the weight of their gaze, their sorrow and anger pressing down on her like a physical force. "You have to help them," Lily said, her voice barely audible over the growing noise, "or they'll never let you leave." Sarah's mind raced as she tried to process what was happening. How? How do I help them?" Lily didn't answer. She simply stared at Sarah, her expression unreadable. And then, the figures surged forward. The path Lily led Sarah down was narrow and treacherous, flanked by jagged rocks and trees that loomed like silent sentinels. The air grew colder with every step, the chill biting through Sarah's jacket and settling deep in her bones. The moonlight barely reached the path, swallowed by the dense canopy above. Sarah kept her flashlight trained on Lily's small figure ahead, the beam catching the faint shimmer of her dress. "Where are we going?" Sarah asked, her voice echoing faintly in the stillness. "To where it ended," Lily replied, her tone somber. "And where it can begin again." Sarah's grip on the flashlight tightened. She didn't fully understand what Lily meant, but she knew there was no turning back. The weight of the notebook in her bag felt heavier, as if the answers she sought were pulling her towards something inevitable. The path opened suddenly into a clearing, and Sarah stopped in her tracks. In the center of the space stood a decrepit wooden structure, what looked like an old schoolhouse, its roof sagging and its windows shattered. Vines crept up its sides, and the faint scent of mildew and decay hung in the air. "This is it," Lily said, turning to face Sarah. "This is where we were taken." Sarah's stomach churned as she took in the building. It looked like it had been abandoned for decades, yet there was something distinctly menacing about it, as though it were alive and waiting. "What happened here?" Sarah asked. Lily hesitated, her gaze drifting to the ground. "We were lured here, promised safety, food, warmth. But it was a lie. And when we realized what was happening, it was too late." Sarah swallowed hard, her mind racing. "Who lured you? Who did this to you?" Lily didn't answer. Instead, she motioned toward the schoolhouse. "You'll see." The door creaked loudly as Sarah pushed it open, the sound reverberating through the empty halls. The interior was worse than the exterior. Desks lay overturned, papers littered the floor, and the walls were covered in a thick layer of grime. The faint smell of smoke lingered, as if a fire had once raged through the building but never fully consumed it. Lily stepped inside without hesitation, her bare feet making no sound on the warped floorboards. Sarah followed, her flashlight cutting through the darkness. The beam caught strange symbols carved into the walls, circles, crosses, and what looked like runes. A shiver ran down her spine. "What are these?" Sarah asked, tracing one of the symbols with her fingers. "Marks of protection," Lily said. "They were supposed to keep us safe, but they didn't work." Sarah's pulse quickened. Why didn't they work? "Because the danger wasn't outside," Lily said quietly. "It was inside." The words sent a chill through Sarah, and she instinctively checked over her shoulder. The building felt too quiet, too still, as though it were holding its breath. Lily led Sarah to a set of stairs at the back of the schoolhouse. They descended into a basement, the air growing colder with each step. The flashlight flickered, and Sarah tapped it against her palm, her nerves on edge. The basement was a stark contrast to the rest of the building. It was eerily clean, the floor made of smooth stone and the walls lined with shelves. On the shelves sat rows of jars filled with murky liquid, their contents obscured but unmistakably organic. Sarah's stomach turned. "What is this place?" she whispered. "A sanctuary," Lily said, her voice tinged with bitterness. "Or so we thought." Sarah moved closer to one of the jars, shining her flashlight on it. Inside was what appeared to be a small, withered hand. She recoiled, nearly dropping the flashlight. They used us, Lily said, her tone hollow. For experiments, for rituals. We were nothing to them. Sarah's breath came in shallow gasps as she took in the horror of the basement. The jars, the symbols, the oppressive atmosphere. It all pointed to something far darker than she had imagined. A sudden sound broke the silence, a faint creak, like footsteps on the floor above. Sarah froze, her flashlight trembling in her grip. Lily's expression didn't change. She simply stared at Sarah, her eyes filled with an emotion Sarah couldn't quite place. "You're not alone here," Lily said. Sarah's heart raced. "What do you mean?" Before Lily could answer, the footsteps grew louder, descending the stairs. Sarah backed up against the wall, her flashlight trained on the stairwell. A figure emerged, a man in a tattered suit, his face gaunt and his eyes sunken. He carried an air of authority, yet there was something deeply unsettling about him. "You shouldn't have come here," the man said, his voice low and gravelly. Sarah's instinct screamed at her to run, but her legs refused to move. "Who are you?" The man ignored her question, his gaze shifting to Lily. "And you? Haven't you caused enough trouble?" Lily stepped forward, her small frame radiating defiance. "You lied to us," she said. "You said you would protect us, but you let them take us." The man's expression darkened. "I did what I had to do. You don't understand the cost." Sarah's mind raced, piecing together the fragments of the story. "You were supposed to protect these children," she said, her voice rising, "but you betrayed them." The man's eyes narrowed. "You don't know what you're talking about. I saved them from a far worse fate." "Saved them?" Sarah repeated, her voice filled with disbelief. "They're trapped here. You condemned them." The man took a step closer, and Sarah raised the flashlight like a weapon. "You think you can fix this?" he sneered. "You think you can undo what's been done? You're a fool." "I have to try," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her. The man let out a cold laugh. "Then you'll end up just like them." The man moved toward Lily, his hand outstretched as if to grab her. But before he could, Sarah stepped between them, her flashlight shining directly in his face. He recoiled, his form flickering like a faulty hologram. "Leave her alone," Sarah said firmly. "She's not yours to control." The man's form began to dissolve, his voice echoing through the basement. "You don't know what you've unleashed." And then he was gone, leaving Sarah and Lily alone in the suffocating silence. Lily turned to Sarah, her expression one of gratitude mixed with sadness. "You've given us a chance," she said, "but it's not over." Sarah nodded, her resolve hardening. "What do we do now?" Lily looked toward the far end of the basement, where a heavy wooden door stood ajar. "We finished this." The wooden door at the far end of the basement stood like a silent challenge, heavy and weathered with age. Sarah's flashlight barely reached its edges, casting faint shadows on the stone floor. Lily stood beside her, her small hand gripping Sarah's trembling one. "We go through there," Lily said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Sarah nodded, though her heart was pounding. "What's behind it?" Lily hesitated, her gaze fixed on the door. "The truth." The cryptic answer only added to Sarah's growing unease. But there was no turning back now. She had come too far, seen too much. Taking a deep breath, she reached for the door handle, its surface cold and rough beneath her fingers. The door groaned on its hinges as it opened, revealing a cavernous room lit by the dim glow of candles. The air was thick with the acrid smell of wax and something metallic, blood, perhaps. In the center of the room stood a stone altar, its surface marred with stains that Sarah didn't want to identify. Surrounding it were more jars like the ones on the shelves, their contents obscured but no less horrifying. On the walls were carvings far more intricate than the ones upstairs, symbols and patterns that seemed to shift under the flickering candlelight. They seemed alive, pulsating with a malevolent energy that made Sarah's skin crawl. "This is where they brought us," Lily said, her voice trembling. "Where they used us." Sarah felt a wave of nausea. "Used you for what?" Lily didn't answer, but Sarah didn't need her to. The evidence was all around her, screaming the answer in whispers she didn't want to hear. As Sarah stepped further into the room, A sudden rush of cold air swept through, extinguishing half the candles. The room plunged into semi-darkness, and Sarah's flashlight flickered violently before stabilizing. She spun around, her pulse racing, but there was no one there. Then came the voices, soft at first, indistinct, like a distant conversation. But they grew louder, more insistent, until the air was filled with overlapping whispers. They came from everywhere and nowhere all at once, rising and falling like a tide. "Do you hear them?" Lily asked, her voice trembling. Sarah nodded, her throat dry. "What are they saying?" "They want us to stop," Lily replied. "They don't want the truth to come out." The whispers grew sharper, angrier, as if in response to Lily's words. Sarah felt a sudden pressure in her head, like the room itself was trying to crush her. She staggered but managed to keep her balance. "What do we do?" Sarah asked, her voice shaking. Lily pointed to the altar. "It's in there. The thing that keeps us here." Sarah's heart sank as she approached the altar. Its surface was covered in a layer of grime and soot, and the air around it seemed to hum with energy. There was a small compartment beneath it, secured with a rusted lock. Lily stepped forward, her gaze steady. "You have to destroy it." "How?" Sarah asked. But before Lily could answer, the room shifted. Figures began to emerge from the shadows, pale, translucent shapes that flickered like candlelight. They were children, their faces gaunt and their eyes hollow. They filled the room, surrounding Sarah and Lily, their expressions a mix of sorrow and rage. One of them stepped forward, a boy no older than 10. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice echoing unnaturally. "I'm trying to help," Sarah said, her voice breaking. "I want to set you free." The boy's expression hardened. "You can't. None of us can leave." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. "Why not?" Before the boy could answer, a new figure appeared. A towering, shadowy form that seemed to absorb the light around it. Its presence was suffocating, its eyes glowing with an unnatural red hue. The whispers turned into a deafening roar as the figure stepped forward, its voice booming over the chaos. "You have no place here," it said, its tone dripping with malice. Sarah gripped the flashlight tighter, her fear threatening to consume her. "What are you?" "I am the keeper," the figure replied, "the guardian of what remains." Lily stepped forward, her small frame dwarfed by the entity. "You're the reason we're trapped," she said, her voice defiant. The figure turned its gaze to her. "I am the reason you still exist." The pressure in the room grew unbearable, and Sarah dropped to her knees, gasping for air. She could feel the weight of the entity's gaze on her, its presence like a dark cloud pressing down on her soul. "You want to destroy me?" the figure asked, its voice a low growl. "You will only destroy yourself." Sarah looked to Lily, who nodded. "You have to do it," Lily said. "It's the only way." With trembling hands, Sarah reached for the compartment beneath the altar. The lock crumbled at her touch, as if it had been waiting for this moment. Inside was a small, blackened object, a heart-shaped locket, its surface cracked and charred. The whispers reached a crescendo as Sarah held the locket, its surface burning against her skin. The entity lunged toward her, its form twisting and writhing like smoke. But before it could reach her, Lily stepped between them. "Go!" Lily shouted. "Destroy it!" Sarah hesitated for a split second before throwing the locket onto the ground and smashing it with the flashlight. The room erupted in a blinding light, the shadows disintegrating into nothingness. The whispers faded, replaced by a deafening silence. When Sarah opened her eyes, she was back in the basement. The jars were gone, the altar reduced to rubble. The air was still, and the oppressive energy that had filled the room was no more. Lily stood beside her, her form flickering like a dying flame. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft. "Is it over?" Sarah asked. Lily nodded. "For us, yes. But for you, be careful. It's not always over." Before Sarah could respond, Lily faded away, leaving Sarah alone in the quiet, empty room. Back in her car, Sarah sat in stunned silence, the events of the night replaying in her mind. The doll sat on the passenger seat, its glassy eyes staring straight ahead. As she started the engine, the radio crackled to life, a child's voice whispering faintly through the static. "Thank you, Sarah." She didn't know whether to smile or cry. Instead, she drove into the night, the weight of what she'd done settling in her chest. For the first time in weeks, she felt a glimmer of peace, but she couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't truly the end. And as the road stretched out before her, the shadows seemed to grow just a little bit darker.